It's in our blood. This was a key phrase in the marketing and promotional materials for Mortal Kombat 1, and it couldn't be more accurate. For multiple generations of players, it was the fighting game that they grew up with. These days, when people talk about major fighting game titles, we usually hear about Tekken, Street Fighter, and more recently, Guilty Gear Strive. Yet, MK is scarcely mentioned in this context. The reasoning behind this is pretty straightforward. The current Big Three is made up of games that have the biggest online player bases and consistently have lots and lots of tournament entrants. However, looking at it from that perspective doesn't paint the most accurate picture. While the competitive scene of NRS games might fall short compared to its peers, it didn't stop Mortal Kombat from becoming the best-selling fighting game franchise of all time, with no signs of slowing down. In our day and age, when fighting game purists scoff at anything that isn't an old-school 1v1 battle, MK's current success plays contradictory to what hardcore players think versus what casual players think. To make sense of this overwhelming task will be the purpose of today's video. Let's take a look back at what led to the popularity of Mortal Kombat and its continued success today. So where did it all start? The details will change a bit depending on who you ask, but all versions seem to agree that Street Fighter II served as a catalyst in one way or another, either as a game that convinced Midway to produce their own competitor, or as inspiration for Boone and Tobias to pitch a game that they had been thinking of for some time. Narc from 1988 is another surprisingly important game here, as it was the first Williams Midway title that used digitized graphics. Boone and Tobias immediately realized how cool it could be to use this new technology for a fighting game, since it could provide the sort of fidelity that nobody else in the genre could brag about. But graphics alone are never enough just by themselves. The team of developers, which was only 4 people at the time, had to come up with a cool setting, characters, story, music, tone, and of course, the mechanics, the meat and bones of any fighting game. Luckily, they had plenty of good ideas floating around, with much of the presentation inspired by the best of action movies at the time, and Daniel Pesina making a clever suggestion to make the ninjas more interesting by basing them on the Chinese Lin Kuei assassins. While janky, the gameplay wasn't too far behind in creativity. Like a mix between Street Fighter and Karateka, it was a nice combo of more realistic punches and kicks, mixed with over-the-top powers like freezing ice balls, teleports, flying, and more. And as a nice break between intense fights, you had a neat minigame that made you mash your heart out. But we all know what gave the original MK that extra oomph: the over-the-top violence. As Ed Boon said, when they put the uppercuts into the game, everyone wanted to come in and see the spectacle of a guy flying up in the air after getting punched, with sprays of blood flying everywhere. That's when they knew it was something special. Believe it or not, the iconic fatalities were also a result of Ed playing Street Fighter II and getting annoyed by the dizzy mechanic, and I feel him there. Instead of letting opponents get a free hit, why not turn it into a spectacle? A brutal finisher that both players can enjoy. While Mortal Kombat had plenty of marketing, including the iconic Mortal Kombat commercial, the bloody spectacle is what took the game to a completely different level. Thanks to the countless out-of-touch politicians and concerned activists, everyone in the world was notified that there's a sick fighting game out there where you can rip someone's spine out. The sheer novelty combined with cool presentation and serviceable gameplay was enough to instantly propel it into the mainstream, with Mortal Kombat clones popping up in no time at all. But instead of looking at the competition, Midway was just forced on refining what they already had, which was why MK3 is often considered to be the pinnacle of the early MK games, despite some questionable roster choices. After gaining this insane momentum, everyone wanted more Mortal Kombat, and they delivered. Outside of constant game releases, there were comic books, toys, novels, and even movies. MK being one of the earliest gaming IPs to receive a big movie adaptation is a real testament to how popular it was. And while the movies were pretty cheesy, even those who dislike MK games tend to remember the OG adaptation with special fondness.
Your soul is mine.
But it didn't take much time until the team of developers grew alongside their ambition. This is where we enter. The 3D era. Perhaps less iconic than the Origins, this is still a key part of MK's history of how it turned into a great game instead of just a violent one with cool ninjas. The late 90s were no longer an era of arcades, but not all fighting game publishers understood this as early as Midway did. To reflect this change in the industry, MK had two projects brewing. One was the MK Mythology Sub-Zero, headed by John Tobias. They took the foundation built by the previous games and used it to create a narrative-focused beat-em-up with some platforming and, so bad it's good, live-action cutscenes.
Believe what you will, Sub-Zero. Goodbye, Ninja.
To no surprise, fighting game controls and mechanics didn't transition into an adventure game too well, and the critics absolutely hated it. And yet, the players were enjoying the campy atmosphere and janky controls, leading to a surprisingly great number of sales. On the other front, Ed Boon was coming up with a game that would define a new direction in Mortal Kombat for over a decade: Mortal Kombat 4. In many ways, this game was just a glimpse of what's to come. The ending slides now become fully voiced and animated cutscenes, albeit often bad in a funny way.
The battle is finished. Your quest for vengeance is over, Scorpion.
You cannot kill a dead man. You have defeated my physical form, but my soul is eternal. You will pay for the massacre of my clan and family.
Game modes were also significantly expanded. You could test your skill with Endurance mode, run small tournaments with other people or CPUs, fight team battles, and it even had a proper practice mode. While gameplay largely stayed familiar, there were a few important changes, like giving characters signature weapons, stage interactions, and making use of the new dimension within the sidestep dodges. It's a bit of a blind spot in the franchise at this point, but the innovations of MK4 have allowed Midway to launch into a new era of Mortal Kombat with full confidence and vision of how to make everything bigger and better. This is a very important detail for our video, because this complete understanding of what players wanted is what allowed MK to become such a massive success. Nothing exemplifies this better than the 4 titles that followed it, all made exclusively for home consoles. Deadly Alliance was first among them, and was a massive graphical leap from MK4. While it didn't have too many extra modes, it offered something very interesting. The new Conquest mode reflected the growing complexity of fighting games, and encouraged players to learn fundamentals, as well as character-specific things through a series of game missions. Meanwhile, the Crypt was a collection of coffins that rewarded you for playing the game by letting you unlock hundreds upon hundreds of extras, from new characters to stages, outfits, and behind-the-scenes materials. The 3D elements also became infinitely smoother, bearing closer to resemblance to Tekken. Most notably, Deadly Alliance brought a much-needed revamp that made MK feel fresh again. Instead of the more or less universal attacks across every character, they now had not 1, but 3 unique stances, usually representing 2 different martial arts styles, as well as their signature weapon. This is all nice, but MK wouldn't be able to keep up with the ever-evolving market if they had just stuck to this formula. So they continued to expand and refine, with Deception making a leap forward and turning Conquest into a fully fleshed out single-player campaign that introduced us to Shujinko, a protagonist that aged and matured as you progressed the story. And while they did compromise on the number of coffins in the crypt, there was still so much for you to discover and unlock, which kept the game feeling very rewarding. Even the little side distraction grew more fun, with a fake chess mode and puzzle combat, which was a pretty on-the-nose copy of Puzzle Fighter. The final game of the 3D era, Armageddon, had little to offer in terms of innovation and instead expanded in breadth and quality. To this day, this roster is unmatched. Everyone was there, every character you could want. They even added some characters that you hate. No roster is complete without a few of those. If that wasn't enough, you could create your own fighter as well, though within limits of course. And the new Super Mortal Bros cart was a lot more fun compared to previous side modes. There's one game that deserves a special mention, however, a game that fans to this day want to see either a remake of or a sequel of, Shaolin Monks. To this day, it might just be the best example of how to do a fighting game spin-off. There are plenty of fighting game titles that tried their hand at beat-em-ups, but there's one very important feature that set Shaolin Monks apart from the rest: the co-op. While single player is important, many of us played together in the arcades, or having people come over to mash buttons. It only makes sense to take advantage of that and offer people to fight alongside each other instead of against. Many people still await the rebirth of Shaolin Monks, but aside from some rumors on a remake, there isn't much there. This brings us to the turbulent end of Midway, and a new beginning for Mortal Kombat. In 2008, Midway released their last Mortal Kombat game, MK vs. DC. Just like Deadly Alliance, this game was a stepping stone that led the franchise to where it is today. The generational leap allowed the developers to upscale once again, defining not only the future titles, but likely influencing many others in the genre. To be more precise, while it was light on side content compared to what MK usually offers, it was the first game in the franchise to feature a robust story mode that presented itself like a movie, where control is smoothly passed onto the player during the fights. Instead of watching some ending slides or cutscenes for every character, people got to enjoy a comprehensive script with a more definitive storyline and characters. It's also worth noting that this is the first major crossover for MK. While Capcom explored a similar concept more than a decade before MK vs. DC, the latter has opened up a new horizon for the audience that wasn't originally into fighting games and likely influenced the abundance of guest characters in games that followed. While MK9 started with just Kratos and Freddy, we have since got to play so many action and horror icons that it's honestly a crucial part of the franchise at this point, as well as something that keeps bringing in new players. Despite series veterans lamenting on the lack of ultraviolence, MK vs. DC was a massive success, becoming the best-selling installment in the series since 2002. And yet, much like how the ideas of Deadly Alliance were only fully realized in Deception, MK9 was where their new approach would truly come into its own. Now operating as NetherRealm Studios, MK was a new beginning for the series that was supposed to combine everything they learned in almost 2 decades while making sure all of those elements are better than ever. The story mode was much longer and more sophisticated, the roster nearly flawless, unless you were a huge fan of the 3D newcomers. The crypt was a step back in a way, and only served to unlock collectibles, but coffins were now replaced by much more varied and often very gruesome alternatives. Finally, the gameplay and content wasn't the only focus. The presentation was truly next level. Arenas reacted to the action happening on the screen. Characters would get bloodied and bruised, with their clothes getting torn and tattered. Most notably, it delivered on the series' trademark of brutal violence by introducing X-ray attacks, which are now a staple. This is also where fatalities started to become increasingly shocking and elaborate. To this day, it's often looked back on as the best or one of the best games in the series. MKX and 11 would, for the most part, continue to build on these ideas. Story modes largely grew in scale without any drastic changes, but the single player would evolve significantly over time. In MKX, the crypt resembled the old-school dungeon crawlers like Wizardry or Might and Magic, but in MK11, it evolved into a full-on adventure game with locations to explore and puzzles to solve. Most notably, this is where NRS caught on about how important online is for fighting games. In a now somewhat famous GDC talk, Michael Stallone explained how NRS had to spend almost a year and a whole lot of money to have a team of experts retrofit rollback netcode into Mortal Kombat X and Injustice 2. This is all well before rollback became a standard, so MK actually had rollback netcode way before some other companies even began to consider it. Needless to say, their new trajectory paid off. MK9 alone covered the cost of Warner Bros. Acquiring the then bankrupt Midway, with MKX and MK11 collectively selling almost 30 million copies. Which brings us to today. And here we are. Mortal Kombat 1 released after much anticipation. Every new piece of info prior to release just served to hype the game up more and more. The second timeline reset with remixed characters offered a lot of potential. The replacement of the crypt seemed intriguing and robust as well. The release of the game didn't live up to the expectations, however, with plenty of issues cropping up. The PC port was once again undercooked, with generally poor optimization and a plethora of bugs, including the Player 1 advantage, which was promptly fixed, admittedly. Switch port speaks for itself as well. The invasion mode is polarizing to say the least. While some enjoy the long grind for cosmetics and other bonus content, others now miss Shang Tsung's elaborate island that could take a long time to fully explore and uncover its secrets. The online functionality is clearly underdeveloped as well, with a shocking lack of proper online lobbies and no ability to end matches against players with bad connection when playing Combat League. It's worth noting that while MK1's release is lackluster, NRS clearly intends to support it for years to come, and the majority of issues we're talking about right now could be made irrelevant with the passage of time. After all, only time can tell if MK1 will live up to the success of prior titles. What is more certain, however, is that the developers at NRS do know what they're making, and who they're making it for, so it's hard to imagine Mortal Kombat fading into obscurity, or slowing down anytime soon. If there's one thing we can gather from this, it's that the path to success is extremely complex. Who knows where Mortal Kombat would be now if so many different things didn't come together? What if it never caused a stir with its violent fatalities? What if it didn't have the marketing budget to let people know about it? What if they chose to feature random guys in karate uniforms or boxing shorts instead of cool ninjas and wizards and ninja wizards? Despite some luck and pure chance involved in many things, there are still many lessons to be learned from MK that could make other games better. And the best summary for it is that people want a complete package. Competitive players want new systems to master, depth, and smooth online experiences. More casual fans want to see the story, fun single-player modes, and plenty of unlocks to set goals and motivations for their next session, all in a world where we usually have all characters from the start and many unlocks are relegated to DLCs. MK succeeded because it had something for everybody, and no fighting game can hope to reach the same success without thinking about its players, consistently giving them what they want, and then some. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos. If you didn't like the video, give it a dislike and let us know why. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.